Hey gang, I hope everybody is doing well. I'm going to share a brief lecture with you guys discussing briefly the value of, or the role of values in counseling. And I guess a little more specifically, maybe the relationship between values and counseling. So, what are values? Well, just pull in the first definition that came off the internet for me when I plugged the word values into Google. The definition I get back is a person's principles or standards of behavior, one's judgment of what is important in life. And I think that's just about dead on uh, for our purposes as well. For the purposes of our discussion, we are thinking about values in essentially the same way that we always think about values. One aspect of that definition that I think falls a little short is I would stretch it to include not just a person's principles or standards of behavior, but a group of people's or a society's or a community's principles or standards of behavior. And that group of people's judgment about what is important in life. So, where do values come from? Well, they reflect our worldview. They are culture of origin, the culture that we're living in at the moment, our understanding of the world, our family, leaders in society. And I would say that both positive and negative examples influence our values, right? If we see, say, a politician on television advocating a set of values that we largely don't believe in, and they include in their description of values additional values that maybe we haven't thought about a little bit, we might sometimes consider that source and think, well, if he or she thinks that's an important value, I don't. So I would say that we're influenced both ways by kind of modeling behavior and then by seeking to avoid values of people we don't like. You put a bunch of values together and you get a value system. A value system is just the hierarchical ranking of values in terms of importance. The discussion for this week is kind of focused on this, so have that operating in your head as you engage in the discussion. Values comprise a set of beliefs. They are evaluative. Notice the phonetic and spelling similarity between value and evaluative. That's clearly not coincidental. There's emotional influence and emotional impact of values. There are also our existential view of the world influences our values. What we think the world is really about. A person who believes in God and an afterlife may have different values from a person who thinks that this is pretty much a one-shot deal, right? So all of our perspectives on these big issues really contribute to and reflect our values. Of course, values themselves are not directly observable, but we can see them in the choices that people make and in the choices that we make. Now, scooting over for a second to talk about morals and how morals relate to ethics and systems of ethics. Morals are more specifically behavior guiding principles. They're also more frequently derived from religious standards. And we can certainly see and relate to conflicting morals within within the same person, when two morals are at odds with each other within the same person, that person's going to experience dissonance. It could also be when a moral conflicts with not just another moral, but a desire or a goal. So I guess the main point I'm trying to make right here is that values are just what they sound like, an assessment of things that we value. Morals, more specifically, are principles that guide behavior. Now, there are dimensions of values that are related to questions of morality that can provide specific challenges for us as counselors. The standards of competency versus standards of morals, for example. Standards of competency does refer to what's required of an individual as a profession. Perhaps a physician, certainly counselors. What is required by your professional role, and how does that, or does that not, line up with your individual sense of morality? So, for example, if you or I am a person of a specific school of, let's say, religious thought, and we are called upon as professionals to counsel an individual regarding their decision about, let's say, abortion. Go right for one of the big ones. Or let's say counsel someone who is struggling with sexual identity or gender issues. Well, is there any discrepancy between what's required of us as a professional and what we ourselves hold to be our personal morals? You could take it actually and flip it the other way. Let's say you or I are a gay or perhaps trans person, and you're called upon to provide counseling to someone who has a very conservative life perspective and is making decisions relative to choices that don't make sense to your worldview. Right? So you could see where there's some potential dissonance there between a person's individual values and standards of competency required of them as a professional. Another one that is a little different but has some of the same types of tension would be terminal versus instrumental values. For me, I think of this as kind of ends versus the means type deal. Are there terminal states? Let's say, we'll take it out of counseling for a second. Terminal states, say like peace, right? Peace is a super important value for everyone. Well, what if to achieve peace, a leader has to implement an instrumental value that conflicts with peace? Fairly classic example there. And obviously there's a moral dimension to that type of issue. And the idea presented by our textbook authors, and it's a fairly classic idea, is that we can run into these types of tensions as counselors as well. With the main issue again being that there can be times when our individual morals are seemingly in conflict with values established by our profession. Now, kind of scooting over one more time to our primary topic, we have ethics. Ethics are also, like morals, entities that guide how we act. However, ethics are a formalized, usually documented system for determining behavior. Another interesting distinction between ethics and morality is that ethics are generally adopted by someone. So you enter into the counseling profession and you adopt a set of ethical standards, usually right out of an ethical code. Well, that's different from morality, where morality is generally something that we are subject to, either by our family, social system, or religion. So morals, less formal, or less, I guess you could say, specific and systemized, and also kind of a less voluntary thing. So what was the historical role, shifting back to values here, what is the historical role of values in counseling? Well, the perspective in the early development of psychotherapy was that our values do not come into play. The therapist was to remain absolutely value neutral. And I would be willing to bet that some of you guys probably still have this idea kicking around in your head, or frequently students do. It's definitely, there's nothing wrong with that. But a lot of times folks will, and I think actually when I went through my master's program, initially I had the idea like, well, okay, I set my values over here when I do counseling, because I'm not to introduce my values into the counseling situation. There's another aspect, kind of an interesting aspect for how this view came to be. We didn't take this theory sequence together, but if you think about, say, Sigmund Freud and psychoanalytic theory and the idea of tabula rasa, so where the therapist, the analyst in Freudian theory, is blank. It's a blank slate for the patient to project all their stuff onto. That also fueled this idea of values being kind of anathema to counseling. So you got two parts. There's the idea of remaining neutral, to be detached as a clinician, and then you also have this theoretical idea of tabula rasa. And we pretty much held on to that belief into the 1950s. And then we started to see an awakening, an awareness, if you will, that really it's kind of futile to pretend that our values aren't impacting the counseling situation, right? Who among us can really enter into a counseling situation and say with honesty and conviction, I just checked my values at the door, and when I come in and I'm doing counseling with folks, that's just not part of the deal. Well, I'd say none of us could actually do that, because values will contribute to, if and how the client will be diagnosed, uh, whether certain topics will be addressed or discussed at all, which counseling goals are considered possible or appropriate, and how the goals, and more broadly, clients, will be evaluated. Now, these aren't all necessarily, they shouldn't necessarily be valueless areas, right? Uh, it is okay and appropriate for my values to impact the way that I work with clients to develop goals. That is acceptable. The deal is, well, we'll shift back to how that maintains in a second. How we maintain that in a second. But I would like to first talk briefly about what the awareness was, how the awareness came to be, that values were, in fact, part of counseling. And it's just that the field kind of came to terms with the fact that counseling is a value-laden activity. Our text says something interesting about the appropriate role of values in the counseling process. And that is that the counselor's values determine the process of counseling, whereas the client's values determine the content of counseling. So what we value as clinicians and as counselors guides the counseling process, right? The content that folks are working on in counseling should be determined by the folks themselves, right? You have to pardon me, the bullets on this slide, I don't think quite follow what I'm trying to say. And that is that counseling is indeed a values-based activity. The counselor's values are going to, and it is appropriate for them to influence the process of counseling, but not the content of counseling. Now, the bullet that I want to address, I think, is kind of poorly placed, is the one referring to a professional disclosure and informed consent. Our text talks about including our values in the process of informed consent with clients or professional disclosure. And I think they reference it in terms of including it in an actual written informed consent, and then also as part of ongoing informed consent, where clients are made aware of where you're coming from. I don't think that I agree with that as wholeheartedly as the authors would maybe like me to. Now, I'm not saying that it is always inappropriate to disclose our values to clients. I do think that we really want to be careful and really think about it before we do that, and for two reasons. First reason is, who's in counseling, the counselor or the client? Well, the client is. So my values really aren't the target of counseling. And then number two, I think that if we disclose values that are in conflict with client values, and they're kind of major values or perceived as major values, I think that has the potential to significantly damage the counseling relationship, especially if we've maybe misread the situation and we feel comfortable and like we have a rapport that would support disclosing a value that's in conflict. Some values that people hold, when other people conflict with those values, it can make it really tough for people to find that person trustworthy and relatable. So that's my 2 cents. That's what I'd like to say about the idea of addressing values in informed consent, formally in informed consent, or sharing values with clients. So, kind of echoing something we touched on earlier, a value system is a hierarchical ranking of the degree of preferences expressed by an individual or a society. Values provide focus for activities we do and choices we make, right? If you value money a lot, if that's your number one, then certainly the choices you make in terms of career, for example, are going to affect that. I think that's pretty plain to see. So in counseling, the values that are central to the counseling relationship are rights, privileges, responsibility, individuals' right to personal freedom, responsibility to others, responsibility for conducting their own affairs, respect, not to be dominated, and folks have the right to make their own mistakes. So these are values, correct? And in many ways, I think they sort of help put in big clear letters that values are definitely in counseling, and that's okay. Additional values are support, conformity, recognition, independence, benevolence, and leadership. These are also reflected in the counseling relationship, and to pretend that they're not isn't going to work real well. So a big area related to values that there's been kind of ongoing increased awareness relates to culture and ethnicity, and specifically culture. So we know now that it is folly to assume that all people from different cultures, even within the U.S., maybe especially within the U.S., hold universal values, right? Within cultural dimensions, we see differences related to ideas about individuality or individualism versus collectivism, traditional masculine or feminine roles, power distance. Power distance is the idea that folks from some cultures are going to kind of readily accept that the counseling relationship is one in which you, the counselor, holds all the power, and that's how it should be. that there's a continuum there, right? Some folks are going to see the relationship that way. Some folks are not. Uncertainty avoidance, there's going to be, culture is a determinant of how well people deal with certain kinds of ambiguity. So we don't want to kind of walk in and assume that everyone is coming from the same place on these issues. For a while, that was sort of the prevailing approach to kind of, especially here in the States, we're the melting pot, we are all Americans. You might have heard people talk about being colorblind, for example. Well, we've really awoken to the fact that that is not a reality. So we need to become culturally sensitive and work on that as an ongoing thing. So a key point to my whole message today, and hopefully I'm conveying this, is that the counselor, we really want to be aware of our values. We want to not be making decisions where our values are an unconscious influence. We've looked and talked about these areas where values are very influential and acceptably so, but we need to be mindful of that and aware of where our values are. Now, this goes for values that have a place in counseling, independence, all of those things that we were talking about. But then also, we need to be mindful of areas where our values can influence choices that we make without our awareness. Are we interjecting our individual moral positions into the counseling relationship without being aware of it? I think, like many or most things in this field, self-awareness is a huge key to success. You want to be aware of the degree to which your values and the values of the client that you're working on are congruent, and how that influences the outcome of the counseling process. So if they're not congruent, how does that affect things, and what do you do to address that? So the three main functions of values clarification, I think this is pretty cool the way they put this in our textbook. As far as the values that belong in counseling, that you want to nurture and that you want to be part of counseling, you want them to be values that you have chosen freely and thoughtfully. You want to prize them or cherish them, be happy with the choice, find a place that they sit well within you, and you want to act on them repeatedly. So what about when we have values in conflict, and values that affect our roles as counselors that are in conflict? If you look at the slide here, what the main bullets are really focused on is, again, mindfulness. You want to look at one value conflict at a time. something emerges that you don't feel quite okay about, well, you want to figure out where is that conflict. Um, are you being asked to provide services that are outside your comfort zone, and that can be uncomfortable? Or do you feel some conflict because you're having an awareness that you're guiding a counseling relationship without being mindful of values? The values are sort of creeping in there unnoticed. So we focus on each individual conflict, identify specifically what values are in conflict, think of a frame for considering how big a conflict is it. Is this a really big thing, or is it not that big? And then you want to come to a place where you can resolve the conflict. Now there are various strategies for this, and again, we sort of take a little slice of this in our discussion activity, although it's not quite as geared towards conflict resolution. It is geared towards kind of the step before that, realization of where values lie for you. And the approach that we take in our discussion activity is a rational approach. It's an approach where you're kind of breaking things down and looking at them with your very kind of rational, analytic mind. There's also a place for approaching value conflict that is based on intuition, where you're not as bound to your analytic, kind of rational mind. And this strategy, the kind of intuitively led strategy, might work best in situations where boundaries aren't well defined and where the nature of the conflict is a little bit murky, and so you sort of follow yourself until you can find out just exactly what's giving you the problem. So one thing I'd like to touch on in closing, and it refers back to the news clip I shared with you guys at the beginning of the course. I'm going to have to double check and make sure I shared that with you. And if I have not, I will make it available. If you want to check it out again, I believe it was, the link was on the last slide of our first lecture. But the field, contrary to the legislation discussed in that CNN clip, the field of counseling is moving to a model where we are discouraged and in many cases prohibited from referring people out based to another counselor. Like, I can't help this person because of a values conflict. But it used to be fairly common practice, or at least accepted practice, and now the emphasis is much more on, like a physician, we need to be able to work with everyone. Right? That doesn't mean we're going to be the best sort of specialist for every condition that folks face. But it does mean that we are sure that we can serve people who we sort of fundamentally don't agree with. So touching on some key assumptions that are helpful to consider when working to resolve value conflicts within ourselves. We want to be aware that values are a result of every person's process of reacting to a system of values. So there's systems of values, and there's our response to systems of values. And therein lies our values, if you will. No one person can ultimately be held accountable for changing another person's values. Counselors have a tendency to pathologize their clients. We have sort of this, I don't know if you'd call it natural, but orientation to look at people who come through the door and immediately kind of conceptualize them in terms of, I've got air quotes around this, in terms of what's wrong with them. This colors the way that we interact and move the counseling relationship forward. We really want to work towards a bigger perspective where we can see what actually is. And the last thing I'll say, and this is an idea that's conveyed in our textbook, is that it can be helpful to adopt an understanding and a belief that really, truly objective values are the exception and not the norm. We want to kind of move away, at least in our professional role, move away as much as we can from a perspective of wrong versus right, and we know what right is in terms of a value perspective. So again, you guys, thank you. I know it was a little bit longer than usual this week. I appreciate you all sticking with me. Take care.